and welcome everyone to the second podcast of the Hodges Foundation for Philosophical Orientation. My name is Reinhard Mueller, and I'm also the executive director of the Hodges Foundation. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Olga Faccani to our podcast. And Olga Faccani is a PhD candidate at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And she is also the very first Hodges Fellow of our foundation. So we have our Hodges Fellowship program. The idea is that we support dissertation projects which make a significant contribution to the philosophy of orientation. And we're very glad and we're very proud to have you as our very first fellow. And so welcome,
Thank you so much.
Olga.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
How are you today? You're in California and Santa Barbara right now?
Yeah, Santa Barbara right now, and it's the middle of the day, so everything is going well. The weather is good as always, and so yeah. And how about you? How are you doing?
It's great. It's getting cold in Nashville, but it's still not bad. Not bad. Still okay for fall. No, I'm very excited to have you today, and I guess the main idea is I want to introduce you to our audience, and that they get a sense of who you are, what kind of work you're doing, and the dissertation you're working on, the project you're working on, and just what that you're such an impressive researcher and educator. And we would like to, I would like to share this with our audience. So just to maybe get us started, I'm interested myself. So what brought you initially to your work? You know, it's something that working on somebody like Euripides, on the classics, Greek tragedy, it's something quite rare these days, right? And so what brought you there? Where are you from? So give us a little bit of a sense of kind of how everything started.
Absolutely. And the question of why classics is one that I get very often, and we're about to take a break from the classes with winter break. And so I know that when I see family, I'm going to get that question again. Is the classic question that you get at the dinner table with the whole family. Why did you decide to study this, of all things? Let me say a little bit about my background. So I come from Italy. I was born and raised in Italy. And I remember in high school, I think I began becoming really interested in these ancient texts. And I think that the interest in this particular subject matter was kind of prompted by the fact that I think I was in high school when I went to Pompeii for the first time. You know, being in Italy is very close to where I grew up. And I just had this realization, like, people actually lived here, you know, they had a life and they did things. And so these texts, they allowed us to have access to all of this past that was lost. And I also really liked how these texts kind of made sense to me. You know, some of the things that I read and the emotions that the characters were experiencing really spoke to me. And so I found this incredible power in these texts that are so old, you know, 2,000, 2,500 years old, but still could speak to us in our present day. And of all the ancient texts, I became more and more interested in Greek tragedy, because it's a genre where characters can express themselves very strongly, and because they are undergoing all of these very traumatic changes in their lives. And it's kind of the premise of the genre, right? Horrible things happen in Greek tragedy. That allows the tragedians to really delve into the ways that people react to terrible changes like death or suffering, loss and displacement. And so I just found that really interesting and very modern, you know, the way that some of these texts discussed some of these topics.
But why would you then why leave Italy and go to the US to study, I guess, ancient Italian or European things?
I know, my mom reminds me of this every time we talk. It wasn't an easy decision. It was really hard. I had the opportunity to study in the United States when I was very young, because my university in Bologna, where I studied and where I got my degree, had this partnership with universities in the United States. And in a couple of liberal arts colleges, students from Italy could go without having to pay the insane yearly fees of American universities. And I took advantage of this opportunity, and I taught Italian for a year at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. And I got to study there and finish the last year of my degree there. I was a senior with the other students. And so I was exposed to this new way of approaching the classical texts. And I fell in love basically with American academia. And so after I graduated, I wanted to continue studying, and I applied for PhDs. I didn't even know that a person could get a PhD. I thought it was very inaccessible and very expensive. And then instead I discovered that it's a great opportunity to continue studying what you love and doing that and getting paid for it. And so that's what I did.
So let's talk about your research project itself, right? So you're working on Euripides, right? And your title of your dissertation is Tragic Bonds, Death, Disorientation, and Trauma in Euripides.
Yes.
And so Euripides is somebody that is not as widely known as somebody like Socrates or Aristotle, one of those really big people. So who is this guy? Who are you doing your work on, and what brought you there also?
Absolutely. So Euripides is one of the three tragedians, the tragedians that we have tragedies from those ancient times. So we lost an incredible number of texts just due to the passing of time, right? It's very difficult to pass down these ancient texts for millennia, literally. And so inevitably, a lot of those are lost. And when we talk about the genre of tragedy, so this performative genre, and I'm going to say a little bit about that as well, because it's distant from our understanding of what he meant to go see some of these plays performed on stage. But when we talk about this particular genre, we're thinking about three people, essentially, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And these are the three playwrights by whom we have still plays today, like full plays that we can read and we know what they performed on stage back then. And Euripides is the youngest of the three. And I became very interested in particular in him and in his tragedies because of the way that he portrays human suffering. There's a passage in the Poetics by Aristotle, who was one of the ancient scholars that you mentioned. And he says that Sophocles tells us how human beings should be, and Euripides tells us how they are. And so many things have been said by scholars about Euripides. He's been called a feminist, a misogynist. He's been called a realist. He's been called an explorer of human psychology. But I do think that generally it's true that in his works, predominantly, we can really access the way that human beings would react in a very realistic way to horrific changes, essentially. And in his tragedies, and I know because you've read some, and especially the one that I'm working on right now, Trojan Women, you're kind of faced with this overarching question of, how do you deal with losing everything, essentially? And I think it's a very modern question at its roots, because all of us have, to some extent, experienced some changes. Very few of us to the extent that Euripides portrays, granted. But it is a question that we pose for ourselves, if not daily, cyclically, I think. And in the tragedy I'm looking at right now, Trojan Women, Euripides does something that's very revolutionary. He gives voice to people who have lost, to the people who are usually forgotten by history. There's even the famous phrase, history is written by the winners, right? We often and only hear the side of people who won and people who then record what they've done. but Euripides gives voice to people who've lost. And a lot of us are very familiar with the War of Troy. You don't have to be a classicist to know about it. Anyone who's watched the film Troy with Brad Pitt is more or less familiar with this huge battle that occurred between the Greeks and the Trojans, originated by the fact that Helen was taken to Troy by Paris. And long story short, Troy was destroyed, right? With the Trojan horse, this wooden horse that was taken inside the city, and it was hiding the best of the Greek warriors, who then set fire to the city, killed all the men, and made the women into slaves. And in the Iliad, which is one of the main sources for this myth, you don't really get to hear what happens after that. And so in Trojan Women, in this tragedy that I'm currently working on, and this is one of the 3 works that I'm looking at in my dissertation, Euripides tells us exactly about that. You know, it's this big question of, okay, so I'm a Greek, my people won in this battle, but what about the people who lost? And it's this account of despair, essentially. And I really like it because the women pose questions that are so important in human life. You know, is the question of, you know, what makes me me, right? What determines my identity, for example. These women used to be royals and now they're slaves, and they used to be Trojans, but now their cities burning, and they used to be mothers and wives, but now their kids are dead and their husbands are lost. And so what remains, right? What are you? And so essentially I became really interested in Euripides as a tragedian because of the attention that he gives to precisely these questions, because he's not afraid of just plunging very deep into despair, into suffering. And it might sound a little bit depressing. I don't do this all the time. But I think that it's a way that these ancient texts really connect to us, to anyone who's ever lost someone, anyone who's ever undergone a traumatic change, for example. And so it's something I like for that reason, because it speaks to us.
So we have Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus, and from this period, those are the big tragedies come from there, mm-hmm. right? And also, I guess, ancient Greece has invented tragedy in a sense, if we can say that. Right? And I always, so it would be interesting to see why did it happen there, and what was the context? So something,
right?
You know, we are in ancient Greece, and the Egyptians didn't have tragedy as far as we know, right? And so, like, why was it invented there? What was the meaning? What was the significance of the invention of tragedy for the ancient Greeks?
I think that looking at the context, the historical context, but also what we know from archaeological remains, from pottery, from these texts, is really important to understand the kind of experience that it must have been to assist to these performances. And we have to kind of separate the idea that we have of these performances from the way that we experience plays today at the theater, right? You buy a ticket and then you go see a play pretty much whenever you want, whenever there are plays. But in ancient Greece, it was a very different experience. So in the 5th and 4th century BCE, which is when these tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were performed, the way that you would experience these plays was in the context of a festival. And the main festival that would occur in Athens at the time was the Great Dionysia. It was a festival dedicated to the god Dionysus, and it would bring together not only many Greeks, but also foreigners. It happened in the spring. So in the spring, the seas could be traveled more easily. So a lot of foreigners would come to Athens at that time. Slaves and medics could also participate in these performances, so they could be part of the audience. And so these performances would bring together many different people. And so we have to imagine this, a context where communities, collectivity of people would come together and assist to these performances, but also within the context of this religious festival. And so performances were really just one of the things that people would watch as part of this festival. But the festival itself began with transporting a huge statue of Dionysus to the theater, so that when you sat down on your seats and then you would watch these performances, the god Dionysus would be looking at the stage with you, right? He would be in the audience quite literally. And tragedies were, like I said, one of the things that you would assist to, but then there would be dithyrambic competitions. Dithyrambs are ancient Greek hymns sung and danced in honor of Dionysus. And then on the fifth day, there would be comedies. And so comedies would be performed as well. And the way that these Greek tragedies would be performed was in groups of 3, followed by a satyr play. So these tetralogies recited in one day. So when we think about our modern day experience of watching a play, if it lasts a long time, it lasts 2-3 hours. This was very different. You would be sitting in the theater for an entire day, basically, because you would watch 3 tragedies and then 1 extra performance, a satyr play. We only have 1 left from antiquity. And this was meant to kind of provide a bit of a pause after these tragic performances, where the audience follow the characters through these horrific changes. And then in the satyr play, you will kind of release some of that energy and laugh, because they were meant to be very comical. And then these performances would be judged, and so there would be a winner at the end of the festival, and the winner would be chosen not by drama specialists or by scholars, which is what we would imagine today, but by 10 judges chosen by lot, who would then choose the winner of these performances. And so participating in this would be kind of a week-long experience that was very religious, very political as well. This festival was paid by the state, by the polis, by the city of Athens, essentially. It really brought the community together in a way that it's kind of difficult to find a counterpart for that, just because of the size, right, of these festivals, and also because of the occasion, this religious festival in honor of the god Dionysus.
We can slowly maybe move towards the topic of your dissertation, this question of trauma, disorientation, death, and so on. And it seems that these tragedies address traumatic events, and that's connected to catharsis to some extent, right? And so maybe can you explain what is catharsis to somebody who doesn't know?
It's a huge question. We have to again turn to Aristotle, who's an ancient philosopher, and in his Poetics, he talks precisely about this, about the fact that tragedy, and in particular, being part of the audience who would watch these tragedies on stage, would produce this emotional cleansing of the passions, this catharsis. And to be quite frank, we don't really know exactly what he meant. I think that one possible explanation is that, watching all of these horrible events appear on stage, and so in this kind of like fictional context, right? You know that those are not real events. You're very much aware that those are actors, right, wearing masks and performing. But you would still be touched emotionally by what was happening, because that's the magic of theater, right? You're kind of transported into this fictional world, and you become kind of invested in what's going on stage. But then with the end of the performance, having experienced all of these very strong feelings, along with the other audience members sitting right next to you and with the actors on stage, then when the performance ends, you're kind of cleansed by all of these emotions of fear, of anger, of envy, of just horror, and then you can kind of experience them in a context that's pretty safe, because it's not real, it's all fictional. And then when you exit the theater, you experience what Aristotle calls catharsis, right, a cleansing. And I think that it's a very interesting question to think about for me in our modern day reality, because it kind of connects to this big question of, you know, the function of theater as a medium to explore these questions of trauma, to explore these questions of suffering. And I think that it was a question that was very much alive in antiquity as well. The theater of Dionysus in Athens is facing the temple of Dionysus, but other theaters that we have with the archaeological remains face other temples, and in particular the theater of Epidaurus, which is a smaller city close to Athens. He faces the temple of Asclepius, and Asclepius is the god of medicine. And so it kind of encourages this connection between theater and healing, right? Or at least stimulates the question of whether there was a connection. And we also have to think about the fact that a lot of these tragedies, they stage sufferings that are the result of war. And war for people in the audience was not something distant and far away or present in their memories, but it was something very, very much of a present concern. I mean, Aeschylus, who's one of the three famous tragedians, he was a veteran, right? He fought a marathon. And so when they described events that occurred at war, they would know it wasn't just an invention. And a lot of the members of the audience would in turn be veterans, would be people who had either fought or lost someone, you know, children of soldiers who were fallen at war. The very end of these festival would feature a procession of orphans of war. And so this idea of loss because of an extremely traumatic event, which is battle, right? Fighting and possibly losing your life on the battlefield, was very much present in the mind of the audience. And so I think that it's also what makes these texts so interesting as platforms to kind of explore some of these issues of suffering, of trauma, but then also of oppression, of displacement more closely. And at UC Santa Barbara, I got to do a little bit of that because my research is very much kind of spanning across the field of classics, but also the field of theater. And I collaborate with this theater program at UC Santa Barbara called the Odyssey Project. And in this project, UC students collaborate with incarcerated students at the Ventura Youth Correctional Facility, and they explore some of these ancient texts. Recently, we focused on the Trojan women. We created this new project called the Trojan Women Project, which is the tragedy I'm looking at right now in my research. And it really provides this framework for students to look at these questions in a way that detaches themselves from, you know, their personal experience, so you can access some of these very painful topics without being necessarily invested personally. If you want, you can take on the voice of some of the women in the tragedy who are suffering, for example. But it allows like very deep conversations about this. And so I think that this is another reason why I'm really drawn towards some of these texts, the fact that they do allow these conversations, not just with classics scholars, but with practitioners of theater, with really with pretty much anybody who has at some point in their lives experienced a change, had the need to reorient themselves, had the need to find kind of new standpoints, right? Like new sort of things to rely on in their lives. And this genre is essentially built around the idea of losing your footholds.
I liked what you just brought up, the connection to Dionysus, and just me, somebody who has done some work on Nietzsche. I'm very excited to hear that that you're working on, or that Dionysus is connected with the theater, right? He's the
yes.
god of the theater.
Yeah.
So now it's interesting that Dionysus is somebody. He's the god of destruction, of death, but also of rebirth, fertility, right? And of wine and all these, also I guess plurality in a sense, and change.
Yes, very much so.
And so it's interesting that just wondering about this connection that Dionysus, and so Dionysus, rebirth, and then catharsis and healing. and overcoming your trauma in a sense. What do you see this connection, or what are your thoughts about this? Kind of, is there, that the connection between Dionysus and healing your trauma through, I guess in modern terms, we would talk about therapy also, right?
Right.
Maybe
Right.
that's an interesting, that's a question I also wanted to kind of bring up. This whole idea, to what extent was drama of the tragedy especially, was it overall a kind of, we would call therapy today, collective therapy?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and I think that different scholars have different ideas. A scholar of classics, but also of psychotherapy, Jonathan Shea, in his books talks precisely about this. He looks at the way that these tragedies would be performed in front of veterans who would have undergone severe trauma on the battlefield, and so they would relate to these events that would occur on stage in a very personal way. And so that the experience of sitting on your seat and then being surrounded by a community of other people who are likely experiencing what you are would essentially have that healing effect. I think that tying it to the figure of Dionysus is also very interesting, because like you said, he is a divinity that kind of embodies this idea of death and rebirth in the only tragedy we have, where he's the protagonist, he's kind of the star of the show, right? The Euripides Bacchae. He is very much a destructive god. I mean, if we think about the end of the tragedy, where he just causes madness into the other characters, and they kill each other in such horrific ways. But he's also the god of intoxication. He's kind of the god of losing your cool a little bit, right? Crossing boundaries is a huge attribute associated with him. And I think that in that sense, it connects to these performances in a way that perhaps is a bit lost when we read the text. Because one of the elements in these performances, aside from the characters, is this body of actors, the ancient chorus, which is, again, something that we don't really find in modern performances. Perhaps in musicals is the closest thing that we can think of when we have to imagine this body of characters. But these would be 12 to 15 actors who would be coming on stage wearing masks, and they would sing and dance. And in fact, right in front of the stage, there would be this area, the orchestra, which means that it's the space for dancing, essentially. And so this characteristic of Dionysus, of kind of like being the god of intoxication, being the god of madness, of dancing, would again be represented on stage in a very visual way in the dancing of the chorus, right? In some tragedies more than in others, for example, and the presence of the chorus on stage is a huge topic in scholarship, of course, and talking about it very generally always begs generalizations, right? We have to generalize somehow, but certainly the fact that the main function was to provide this other perspective through dance, through singing. Again, it connects very closely to some of the attributes of this god. And then something else that I find really interesting, and again, something that's kind of lost when we just read the text, is the fact that Dionysus was with us watching these plays, right? The statue of Dionysus was there. And so the presence of the god was something that was very much in the minds of the audience at the time, and very difficult to have that in our minds when we access these texts, because like you said, we're not in ancient Greece, but it definitely connects to some of these topics.
Yeah, it's interesting, the figure of Dionysus and what roles you play. As we said, we should probably do another podcast just about Dionysus and see kind of the connections, because he's also philosophically such an interesting figure, at least for Nietzsche.
Right, exactly. And Nietzsche focuses, right, on this duality, the Apollinian and the Dionysian, and it's what he finds most interesting in these Greek tragedies, and the fact that Dionysus appears in a variety of figures. It appears in the masks, right? That the figures of Prometheus, of Oedipus, they're all masks of the original hero Dionysus, right, of the god. And the fact that Dionysus is also kind of an elusive figure. I mean, we know in the Bacchae, again, we have to refer to the tragedy where he's protagonist. He wears different masks, right? And so it's not far-fetched to imagine that perhaps his face is hiding behind some of these characters on stage. Now, of course, with Nietzsche, ironically, we have the fact that he kind of attacks Euripides as being the one responsible for driving Dionysus off the stage, and then, more generally resulting in the death of tragedy. But then we have this inconsistency because Euripides is the author who actually puts Dionysus on stage at the same time. And so I find him an extremely interesting philosopher to read, especially coming from classics and accessing philosophy through classics. Especially because of these polarities, right? Of these paradoxes that he explores, and paradoxes are everywhere in tragedy, or everywhere in scholarship. And so I think that just embracing them and kind of delving into them with curiosity and an open mind is what makes this work fun.
So to come back to Euripides, he's, as I said, he's kind of sometimes known as the existentialist of the three poets. I felt he was quite modern. My impression is of ancient scholars, they often consider Sophocles and Aeschylus more important. Aristotle says in the Poetics that he is, quote, the most tragic of the poets. What are your thoughts about all these opinions?
Yeah, and I think that Euripides is probably the one of the three tragedians that most embodies some of these polarities that have been associated with him throughout the history of scholarship. The fact that he's been seen as different things at once, like a feminist and a misogynist, a person, one who brought tragedy to the level of everyday life, right? That devalued tragedy with realism, but then also one who explored human psychology extensively in his tragedies. And the term psychology is very modern, so it's anachronistic in this context, but just meaning that his characters are very complicated, very changeable, right? They go through many human emotions, they change direction, they change opinion very suddenly. And when Aristotle says that he's the most tragic of the poets, the context of this suggests that we have to think about the preference of Euripides for very unhappy endings in some of his work. But I think that it really extends to a much wider meaning, much wider sense. And the fact that, again, Euripides predominantly represents human sufferings, and he pushes the limits of what you as a member of the audience can stand, right? You as a member of the audience can find manageable to see. I mean, if we think about some of the details of Bacchae, the fact that he describes the process of madness and of, decapitating a person essentially, or the actions of Medea, for instance, or even just the despair of the characters in the Trojan women, the fact that he really focuses extensively on the funeral laments and the anticipation of the slavery and sexual slavery in the play. And he must have really pushed the audience to stare into the eyes of what could potentially happen to your life, right? In a way that it must have been uncomfortable in some ways. Perhaps this is the way that Nietzsche saw Euripides and Socrates as being similar, because Socrates also made you uncomfortable all the time, right? He pushed your limits as a person, and pushed your buttons too. And so I think that Euripides does that as well in the tragedies. I mean, even for us as modern readers, kind of separated from the context of these performances, and so we're not experiencing these texts in the very vivid way that members of the original audience would. But even then, reading some of the things that he writes is difficult, right? Because they refer to horrific events, essentially. And so we also have to think about this statement, him being the most tragic of poets and him being a humanist in the context of kind of the way that he was received, even in antiquity. He is probably the tragedian that's been made most fun of in comedy. Ancient comedies kind of made fun of political figures at the time, but also of tragedians at the time. And Euripides was very much represented as this the fact that he dramatized subversive ideas, for example, that he really incorporated sophistic teaching in his tragedies, and skepticism about the Olympian gods, for instance. And the way that he represents the gods in his tragedies is different from the way that, or to an extent, again, we're generalizing, obviously, but he kind of represents the gods as everyday people, right? In a way that it's not really new to us if we come from classics, because that's the way that the gods are represented in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The Homeric gods are victims of pride and jealousy and envy and desire and anger. And this is the way that Euripides also represents them.
So Nietzsche writes that that Euripides, in a sense, rationalized the ancient drama, the ancient tragedy, and that, for example, as you said, he brings the gods become everyday figures. They speak more like an everyday sense. They act like everyday figures. What I've noticed when reading the tragedies was also that they have debates, rational debates,
right?
Kind of like Socratic dialogues almost,
right?
Where they try to rationalize these things. And Nietzsche says that because of this rationalization, the tragedy, in a sense, died because of that. It took away the tragic aspect of it and made it rationally comprehensible for the audience as well.
Absolutely.
So the logos was, in a sense, the driving force. But then how can he still be the most tragic poet, at least for Aristotle?
No, absolutely. And it kind of connects to some of the attacks that are moved against him. The fact that he brings into his work some of these sophistic ideas, right? These debates, what Nietzsche refers to as rationalizing, like you said. And we see this even in the tragedies that most extensively focus on human suffering. For example, in the Trojan Women, we have this almost pause in the dramatic action or in the kind of the portrayal of the sufferings of the women when we have a debate between the character of Hecuba, who used to be a queen in Troy and now she's a slave, she lost everything, and the character of Helen, who's seen in the tragedy by the women as the culprit of the war, as the one who caused the death of so many Trojans, the most beautiful woman in Greece, who was taken to Troy by Paris, this Trojan prince, and she caused the War of Troy because her husband Menelaus sailed to Troy with a huge Greek army and attacked the city for 10 years, and then the city fell. So we have this this debate with the two characters attacking one another and offering kind of rational explanations for the way that they acted, right? Helen says, well, why are you pointing the finger at me alone? I was a victim of the goddess Aphrodite. And Hecuba says, this is just the name that you give to your own infatuation, right? Aphrodite is just a name that human beings give to infatuation, to the mistakes that they make. And so he definitely kind of takes the attention of the audience away from what previously had been the focus of the work, which was the extent of human despair, right? And so in a way, it kind of provides this pause, this moment where audience members can kind of collect themselves a little bit, right? And just for the moment focus on this debate between the two women. But in terms of providing an explanation and kind of rationalizing the behaviors or some of these passions, I'm not so sure that that's what happens, because at the end of the debate, we don't really agree with Hecuba. We don't really agree with Helen necessarily, right? The tragedy itself kind of continues to point us in different directions. Like on the one hand, we can see the hatred and the suffering of Hecuba, and we can see why she points her finger against Helen. On the other hand, we kind of sympathize with Helen too at a certain level. I mean, she talks about how she was given away as a wife when she was very young, and how her appearance became sort of the cause for her sufferings in life. And we don't have a clear direction for, what's true, or a clear direction for what we should believe. And I think that Euripides does this a lot in his tragedies. I mean, he creates this illusion of, either the characters that are playing the gods telling us something that we're supposed to believe that is going to happen. A device that he uses predominantly in his tragedies is to tell us what's going to happen at the very beginning of the tragedy, right? You have this prologue where a character, usually a god, tells us exactly what's going to happen. And so as modern readers, we think, well, but then how are we supposed to enjoy the rest of the play, right? If you just told us what's going to happen, you just gave away the ending. But we do, because throughout the plays, he introduces these changes. And what he says that's going to happen at the beginning, at the end, we're like, well, did it happen? I mean, did it go like he said? And the Alcestis is a great example of that, for example. In the Alcestis, we have a situation where Alcestis, the protagonist, sacrifices herself for her husband, and she's brought back to life by Heracles, who's a Pan-Hellenic hero in ancient Greece. And at the very beginning, where we have a debate between these two divinities, and it seems like Alcestis at the end is going to be brought back. But then at the end, when she's actually brought back from the underworld, she's not really herself. Is this veiled character on stage, and she doesn't speak. And so as a member of the audience, you're kind of left with that doubt. I mean, is that really her, right? And then again, as a modern reader, or even perhaps as a member of the original audience, you start reflecting on kind of what it means to, survive tragedy, right? Survive a traumatic experience. Does that change you to the extent that Alcestis is changed, right? Or is it even you at the end? Is it even you on the other side? And it also dramatizes perhaps very deep desire in people who've lost a loved one, right? That they could have them back. And Euripides says, well, yeah, but even if you had them back, would they be the same person, right? Would you be the same person? And so again, just very modern, sort of like pushing the extent to what we think and what we want to experience, what we want to think about, right? And so I think that a lot of the ways that he stages these debates are meant to elicit just more questions, right? It gives the appearance of solving everything for us and making it really nice and clear. Another device that he uses extensively is the Deus Ex Machina. So the god brought by this machine that created the illusion that the god was flying on stage and then solving all the problems of the tragedy and putting an end to the tragedy. But that's just the ending of the actual play, right? But the questions have not been answered. And so they linger in your mind as a member of the audience, and they linger in your mind as a modern reader, and you keep thinking about it. And so when does the tragedy really end, right? Is it ending when Euripides flies this puppet, right, on stage? Or is that really solving or rationalizing anything? Well, in a way, it kind of poses more questions even, or additional questions, like, why did you end it at this point? Why did you do it this way? And puts the burden of solving these questions on you.
So you're not just a researcher, but also an educator, right? So you do a class about, I think, what displacement. And you read a lot of Greek tragedies, but you also don't only teach at the University of California, but also in a prison, right? And that's quite interesting. So can you tell me, our audience, more about what this is all about?
Absolutely. Yes, I began collaborating with this theater program that teaches in a correctional facility in nearby Santa Barbara 3 years ago. And then during COVID, we kept this class alive, but we had to necessarily transition to teaching it on Zoom. And so the question then became, how do we adapt these texts in a way that's not a performance anymore? We used to have the students perform these texts on stage and kind of transform these Greek myths into their own theatrical representations. And they became actors, they became activists. But then during COVID, we moved to the text of Trojan women. And the students adapted the text and reinterpreted it through storytelling. which was also a really interesting new tool to explore for us, because it really kind of drew the attention to the students of the way that you tell your story in a way shapes your reality. And so the students kind of leveraged this this medium of storytelling to kind of reconstruct the narratives of these women. And so the project was a deconstruction of Trojan women as a text, but also a reconstruction of the participants' lives as this kind of talk back to the oppression that the characters in the tragedy experience. So these women are kept as slaves in these tents, and they are prisoners, right? And so exploring a text like this in a context like prison also gave way to very, very interesting and very deep interpretations of these particular texts. We kind of wanted this tragedy that is so steeped in human sufferings and in kind of despair, right? In a way that at the end of the tragedy doesn't really leave much room for getting back up, right? Okay, so what do we do after this? We kind of imagine the trajectory of the women as continuing to be one of destruction, of suffering. But the way that we reinterpreted it in a class was in terms of imagining a future that was a reaction to that oppression. And so the students gave voice to the struggles of these oppressed women in the tragedy, and then held them up through this creative resilience that they manifested. And it also became a really interesting context for me to kind of ask some questions of practice and of methodology that are true of most contexts of education, but especially true in a context like prison. So there's always that difference, that kind of a distance between the teacher and the student, right? And it's also a difference in terms of power, right? I, the teacher, am judging you, the student. But that disparity in terms of power is even more marked in a context like freedom, where topics like creative freedom or agency, they have a completely different meaning. And so I and the other members of the theater program, we kind of grappled with some of these ethical questions of how to, engage the students in these traumatic backstories of the play's protagonists that are experiencing sexual assault and murder and other atrocities in times of war, without this identification leading the students to a reinforcement of their victimization. Also questions of agency, like how do we allow the students to really retain ownership on the stories that they produce, these beautiful examples of storytelling, and how do we kind of safeguard the agency within this context. And so it's as always, for me, it's been an experience where I felt as much of a teacher as a student sometimes, where I kept kind of learning and evaluating my practice and evaluating the way that I think about some of these questions.
Wow. Yeah, I like this notion of the retelling of the story, and how the retelling, it's a reorientation in a sense,
Right, exactly.
You change the way that you view the world.
Precisely.
Your identity in it, what you identify as in
Yes.
this world, what your place is in this world, right? And it seems that here literature, broadly speaking, has somewhat of a, again, therapeutic function, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just like theater, the birth of the tragedy seemed to have this collective therapeutic function in a way. And it seems that this is something similar what you're doing in prison as well. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's probably a lot of traumatized people. They're young, traumatized people, and they're trying to deal with that trauma.
Right.
And it's probably not easy. Like you want to push it
right
away.
Exactly.
And doing this in a literary, artistic way, creative way, seems to do something. It seems to change something, right? And there's something I've heard in psychology or in therapy that call it bibliotherapy, for example, right? Where you deal with
absolutely
books, you read books, and they give you a language, right, and a structure to understand difficult things that you may not understand, or that you have trouble grasping without a language. right? And so do you see this? Does it have this therapeutic function, this, I guess, or this reorienting function?
I hope so. It's very much a process that deals with orientation and necessarily with disorientation, right? So with sort of like finding your way through some existential changes that are occurring in your life. And the action of owning your story and kind of shaping your story is also carries a lot of power, I think, especially in contexts like prisons, where it's kind of difficult to separate yourself, or at least this is kind of what a lot of our students were voicing, this difficulty of kind of owning your story and separating it from what as being your story in your past, right? Of seeing yourself as more than what people have branded you, right? Or more than what people have seen you in the past, or within that particular context of prison, for example. And so it's a very powerful act. And I think that it is tied, like you said, to healing. It is tied to perhaps even what Aristotle was talking about when he talked about catharsis. Telling your story as a way to reflect on what happened is also present in the ancient texts, right? Some of the oldest texts that we have, the Odyssey, a huge part of the epic is a flashback told by Odysseus about what he lived through, right? So he has an audience, the Phaeacians, and he's telling at a dinner table what happened to him. And the reason why he does that is that people at the table were talking about war, and he started crying. He lost it, right? That was too much, thinking about all the people that he had lost. And so then he started telling his story, and that's the Odyssey. That's what it is. Essentially, it's a story told in first person, a fictional story, of course, but told in first person by Odysseus. And so this action of storytelling, of kind of telling the story of your past, but then in that way kind of tracing a trajectory for your future, I think it's a very powerful one. And I it's one of those things that occurred thanks to COVID, right? Thanks to the pandemic, the fact that we could not explore these texts through theater anymore because we could not access the correctional facilities. It was very dangerous for the students, of course, to potentially spread the virus in there. And so it was just impossible. And doing that on Zoom, we really had to think about an alternative medium for that. And I think that storytelling, just like theater, has so many overlaps with the general notion of orientation, right? I like theater to think about those questions of orientation and disorientation because it creates so many different layers, right? In my research, I like to look at the way that characters orient themselves or reorient themselves in the face of these traumatic changes. But there's also another layer of orientation, which is spatial orientation on stage, right? These are actors performing in front of an audience. And so in a context that requires a very particular orientation. And then in turn, the way that members of the audience orient themselves towards the actors, but also towards each other. They're members of this huge community, and they are, a lot of them have very similar backstories, right? But then storytelling as well is a very powerful medium to think about some of these questions of orientation and disorientation. And I like that in particular because it kind of puts the emphasis on this notion of agency, right? So your own agency in reorienting yourself in the face of trauma, and how you do that, right? How do you find things to hold on to? And the way that you describe that process is very often the way that you enact that process.
What does it then, I guess, look like? I'm wondering, so you did it on Zoom, right? And then they would they kind of write something in the style of Euripides, or kind of forward, and then like what are the footholds, I guess, that are shifting? Is there
Absolutely.
something
That's a great question. Yeah. Writing was a huge part of the work that the students did, and it was not really writing in the style of Euripides, but writing from the text of Euripides. And so sort of exploring a particular episode, for example, or embodying a particular character and then speaking for that character and what that meant. And we kind of extrapolated from the tragedy these macro themes, such as violence, for example, or oppression, right? And what it means to be oppressed. At some point in the tragedy, we have one of the Greeks, one of the commanders, Menelaus, who is the husband of Helen. Is this very powerful king who killed many of the Trojans, and he enters on stage, right? And he confronts Helen in particular, but the women at large. And so what it means to have that sort of confrontation, right? Victimization, for example, was another one, or losing someone, kind of the aftermath of having lost someone that you loved. And another huge theme is separation from family. Displacement as a category that I find really, really interesting, partially because it just speaks to me as an international student, right? A person who's necessarily displaced from my home, my culture, but also because it's explored in so many different contexts. And in the tragedy, these women have been displaced from their role in society. They used to be, a lot of them, royals. They used to be living as free women, and now they're slaves. But also they are anticipating another form of displacement, where they're going to be put on ships and transported to Greece, to a land that they don't know, masters that they have no idea who they are. And so in the context of prison, a lot of students found that category particularly fitting to describe their position, right? Or this liminality, this not being at home, but being in this kind of liminal space of anticipation of what lays in front of you, and fear, right, of what lays in front of you. And so it's very, very productive, I think, text, very rich text, especially for those big themes.
That's interesting. I guess maybe, is that also a reason why Euripides or ancient tragedians address the tragic element more than today's movies do?
The big question of why, to an extent, we like to see suffering on stage or on the screen, right? Just think about so many programs that exist on Netflix on serial killers, for example, or there's a almost like this morbid desire to look at those topics from the safe distance of, I'm an observer looking at something that's happening on a screen or looking at something that's happening on a stage. So very safe in this theoretical seat almost, right? And it's kind of what art in general allows us to do. It allows us to explore some of these questions in a way that is safe, relatively, right? Because you're still experiencing those emotions, but you're not living them. But I think you're right. I think that the extent to which these tragedies focused on human suffering is kind of unprecedented. Again, I think it's useful to also turn to the original context in which these tragedies were performed, which was not, a weekly thing, the way that you just watch TV almost every week or every day. It was at a very specific time during the year, and it was a huge festival. And the performances, the tragic performances, were then followed by an entire day of comedies, right? And so you were kind of experiencing that release, that emotional release. So you kind of experienced a bit of all. But I do think that, yes, the emphasis on the tragic is also probably something that can make us think about topics would hit the audience differently from the way that they hit us. And it's a very dangerous thing to think about, because we don't know, right? We can't have conversations with people who assisted to these tragedies back then, and so a lot of it is simply speculation and just kind of our own interpretation of the text, of the archaeological evidence, of the pottery, for example. But the fact that the members of the audience would have experienced a lot of those traumatic changes themselves, right? And specifically the way that a lot of them would have lived through wars, and the women would have lost loved ones or children. That certainly makes those topics extremely relevant for the time, and for us today, they still are relevant in the way that they kind of speak to change very generally, right? But very powerfully, and they kind of inspire conversations, or at the very least thoughts about what to do in the face of change.
Yeah, that seems to be something that especially Euripides is addressing, right? And also as, I guess, a time of constant war and change and death was all around you, probably more than today, right? It seems.
Yeah, or perhaps experienced more directly than today, right? Because today, I mean, the certain parts of the world are constantly at war, right? There is a war occurring or sufferings occurring in some parts of the world, but perhaps we don't experience them as directly. But like you said, at the time where these tragedies were staged, Greece was at war, right? When Euripides writes some of these tragedies, the Peloponnesian War is happening. So this war of Greeks against Greeks that is very different from the Persian Wars, for instance, where there was this very identifiable enemy, right? The barbarian, the other. But with the Peloponnesian War is you're fighting Greeks, right? Those are your brothers in a way. And so it's something that the people that participate in these festivals would have experienced very directly. And in a way that, yes, you're completely right, marks a huge difference from the way that we are kind of detached from a lot of the sufferings that are kind of filtered through the news or, newspapers or like movies, and they become very distant, and they are distant in our mind as well. They don't really affect us sometimes at all.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. There's so many interesting topics connected with this. I think we are probably at the end for today, but we might pick up, and we should pick up and address some of these things in another podcast.
Yes.
But thank you so much for this conversation today. It was really insightful and interesting to hear all your work you're doing, and we're very happy and very proud to have you as our fellow in our community.
I'm honored, and thank you so much for having me, for this wonderful conversation, for listening to me. Thank you so much.